Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Right now, say the cutting edge research, which is mRNA vaccine, that is to do with ribosomes.
Correct.
Yeah, because message is given to ribosomes, then they go and make the protein in our cells.
Absolutely right. So mRNA that codes for the spike protein is the actual vaccine, and there are some modifications here and there made in that mRNA. mRNA goes in our own cells and makes the spike protein, and that spike protein is now recognized by our immune system as something foreign to our body, and therefore immune system now generates lots of antibodies in our body, which eventually would recognize the virus when it enters the body.
Right.
So when virus comes, the same protein is now seen by our antibodies, and they launch an attack on the virus.
So can I say that your field of specialization is actually the basic field from which a lot of this research is now emerging?
In a sense, yes, because all of us have been working on different aspects of this.
Right.
So
yeah, it's very wide.
That's right.
CSIR, you have a bunch of labs. How much of your work has been focused on COVID, and since when?
So CSIR, what happened was, we had a directors meet on 25th, 26th February earlier last year, and by then the first
These are directors of all your labs. 37 labs?
All 37 labs.
Yeah.
We meet once a year.
Right.
And we met in Goa, and by then already the first case in India had been reported. In Kerala, if you remember, 30th January, the first case was reported, and we knew that we are onto something very serious. WHO had not yet declared it as a global pandemic. WHO declared pandemic on 11th March. But we had started thinking about what we do if the situation actually becomes serious. And by mid-March, we had generated a strategy, all labs together, 37 labs together, that we would have a COVID-19 mitigation strategy. And that was based on 5 different verticals. We defined 5 verticals. One was surveillance, digital and molecular surveillance. The second one was diagnostics. The third one was therapeutics, drugs and vaccines and all. The fourth one was devices. And the fifth was supply chain modules. And then we started working, different labs actually found that they will start working on that.
How is this an improvement over the conventional RT-PCR kit?
So what happens is RT-PCR requires an instrument for doing what we call as real-time PCR, and with very expensive fluorescent drug. Now this equipment itself is quite costly. It costs a few lakhs, right? Around 10-20 lakh rupees is what it costs. Well, this being a paper-based kit, it doesn't cost that much. So the cost has come down dramatically. Moreover, the time spent of doing the entire PCR reaction, typically it takes about 3 to 4 hours in a lab, or even more for doing RT-PCR. This can be done in something like 45 minutes.
So why is it not picking up more in India?
It will pick up because it has just been commercialized.
I see.
It's just only about a month since it has been commercialized. Right. I'm pretty sure that it will pick up.
You told me, I know, when we met earlier, but tell us the story, tell our viewers the story of how this name Feluda came about.
So Feluda actually is some sort of an acronym they have given for this particular thing. FN Cas9 linked uniform enzyme linked uniform detection assay, Feluda, right? Now we were in competition for 2 foremost groups in the world, one in MIT, the Zhang's group, and they had called CRISPR-Cas based thing as Sherlock.
Sherlock, okay.
And Jenny has a group in Berkeley. They're working closely with a company there, and they had called it Detector. And therefore, we had to give a name which is something close to that. Yeah. And Debajyoti Chakravarti's wife, who also is a scientist, and she came up with this idea.
Trust Bengalis to find Feluda.
Exactly. That's right. And it's a beautiful name to that.
Right.
So, when CSIR started in 1942, the British government had committed some...
How did it start in 42? 42 was the year of the Quit India movement. India was in turmoil. How did it start in 1942? Who thought of it suddenly?
So the genesis of CSIR goes in an editorial written by Sir Richard Gregory. He was the editor of Nature then. He wrote an editorial in 1933.
Yeah, we quote from Nature all the time now.
That's right. 1932 or 1933, I may be wrong. He wrote an editorial and said that India must have a science and technology support system. And as a follow-up of that, even Indian Academy of Sciences started in 1933 or 34, I may be wrong. So 33 or 34, around that time. Sir C.V. Raman started that. But British government conveniently forgot about this particular editorial until Sir Arcad Ramaswamy Mudaliar, who was a member of British Commerce Council. He took it up in 1940 and convinced them that we must actually have a public support system for science and technology. And he, and principally efforts of Abdul Khwaja Hamid, who had started CIPLA then.
So the father of Yusuf Hamid.
That's right.
Hamid. Okay.
That's right. Father of Yusuf Hamid. So both of them then started actually some sort of public campaign that we must have a public science and support system. And there began in 1940 a Board of Scientific and Industrial Research, which was converted into Industrial Research Utilization Committee, IRU or something. And then 1942 eventually they convinced Sir Shantiswarup Bhatnagar to move to Calcutta to start CSIR. So it was converted into a society, autonomous society, which is now called as CSIR.
Have you felt during this COVID season, have you felt that we had strengths in many areas, or did you feel also that we could have done better, that India could have invested more in science, so India would have been in a better position to influence this crisis?
So the thing is, most countries have faced this question that were we up to mark or whether we should have done something better. India is no exception to that. The fact that we had invested heavily in science and technology over the years, last 70-80 years, has actually helped us in good stead. So basically our scientific infrastructure could be used very quickly for this particular purpose. But probably we could have done better for having better health infrastructure, and also we should have probably had better infrastructure in handling pathogens or something. See, pathogens are handled typically in very high containment facilities, what we call as BSL-3, BSL-4.
But India has very few BSL-3s.
Correct. And even fewer BSL-4s. And probably we should have invested also in
So how many BSL-4 facilities are there in India? BSL is biosafety level.
Correct. And to the best of my knowledge, we have 1 or 2 BSL-4s.
One will be NIV, I think,
and one
National
is
Institute of Virology.
And one is in probably Bhopal. But that's the best of my knowledge. I may be wrong in that. BSL-3s, there are a number of them. But probably we need to strengthen this particular infrastructure. If a pathogen which is so highly infective, we must actually have facilities such as those to deal with them. And also train next generation of people who are capable of making vaccines and all very quickly, diagnostics, vaccines, drugs. We are often found wanting in some of these areas. Why is this apparent correlation between higher GDP and higher death rate? And obvious explanations that people were put forth where maybe there is underreporting from countries of lower GDP. Maybe people have not tested enough. Already it was known that elder population is more susceptible to the virus than younger population, and the demography of nations is such that in high GDP countries you have higher ratio of elder people to younger people, and vice versa. So we started exploring, but also we knew that people were not dying because of the virus. People were dying because of the way body reacts to the virus. What we call as in medical terms, it's called as cytokine storm.
So basically the virus was turning our own body against us, or turning our immune systems against us.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. So the viral load actually starts coming down by 7th or 8th day, but that is the time when the body starts reacting to things. And that leads to pneumonia-like symptoms, and our lungs become actually then less capacitated for uptaking oxygen. And these are typically also called as autoimmune reactions and all. And the percentage of autoimmune diseases in the higher GDP countries is higher than countries like lower GDP countries. In the lower GDP countries, the disease burden is higher for what is called as the communicable diseases.
Right.
The diseases then people can give from one person to another. Things like tuberculosis, malaria, leprosy, schistosomiasis, filariasis. They are the diseases that travel from one person to another.
Schistosomiasis, filariasis, these are parasitic diseases.
That's right. Cholera. So these are the communicable diseases. The higher GDP countries have brought the burden down effectively by having proper hygiene and making sure that diseases don't communicate between two different individuals. But consequently, their burden of autoimmune disorders has gone up. No means we are telling people that you should actually move to a worse hygiene.
Right.
We are still saying that people you be to more hygiene.
Yeah, because it will save you from many other diseases which are clear and present.
That's right. But what we are saying is that body's immune system is not ready to look at any new disease that comes in.
Right.
And we need to continuously train our immunity for that. And a lot of immunity is trained in our gut. In the gut, there is a variety of different bacteria that live in our gut, you know. And one of the revelations in last 10 years is that more number of bacteria, in fact 10 times more number of bacteria live in our body than our own cells. So we have about 10 to the power 12, 10 to the power 13 cells in our body which are of our own.
Right.
But we have about 10 to the power 13, 10 to the power 14 bacteria which live on our body.
10 to the power 13 or 10 to the power 14 bacteria.
That's right.
And cells?
10 to the power 12, 10 to the power 13.
Oh, I see. So we have more bacteria in our body than we have our own cells.
That's right. So people have started asking some very fundamental question: are we really us or not? Right?
That's a good question. Yes.
So
are we just a bunch of bugs?
Right.
About BCG, that do populations which have a history of BCG vaccination, it's not just our countries, but say Japan, Russia, do they tend to have lesser mortality, and does it indicate that there is some causality?
See, the BCG topic has come up quite prominently in recent times since the COVID outbreak. We have to remember that BCG that is given across the world today for perpetually protecting us against TB is given after we are born immediately, right? We don't take BCG when we are adults. The debate that has come up is that if BCG is given to adults, maybe it will protect adults against COVID. There's a debate. But because BCG has been given to in childhood, our correlation did not show any correlation to BCG in that particular sense. Now I must mention here that a very notable outliers in our study. For example, Japan fatality rate has been very less, South Korea and all. And although these are very high GDP countries, but their case fatality ratio has been much less.
Yeah. So I'm sticking to BCG for a minute. Could it be, because in your study I noticed that you've said that you did not find a correlation, but you found a correlation between BCG vaccinations and incidence of autoimmune disease. So populations which had BCG vaccines had lesser incidence of autoimmune disease. And it's the presence of autoimmune conditions that makes the virus more of a killer. So if you would explain that a little.
Yes, so the BCG in a sense what we can call is actually an immune boosting system in our body, right? What was discovered to be against TB, in fact it's a attenuated strain of what is called as Mycobacterium bovis. Mycobacterium bovis is the one, it's a TB like thing in cattle.
Right.
It's very related to Mycobacterium tuberculosis,
right,
which causes TB. Now what was thought that it will protect us against TB, but turns out that also it's a good immune booster. So it's a good immune boosting bacterium that actually helps.
Have you got some sharp reactions to this? This is too risky, this is too provocative?
Yes, we did indeed get sharp reactions, but some of the very frontline journals thinking that it's too provocative, because what you see in current science is actually much more moderated version than our first version that we submitted to medRxiv, where we had actually boldly stated that it is hygiene hypothesis that is working. There's a very famous hypothesis called hygiene hypothesis.
I see. What does that mean?
So somebody in 1989 proposed that if you are exposed to low hygiene conditions and various pathogens continuously, you become better trained to new pathogens that come in, like COVID-19. And therefore, living in low hygiene countries actually prepares you better for new pathogens that are coming in. There has been much debated.
Yeah, we see that, you know, when we say people from the West coming into our countries, they tend to get sick with our water or our food very easily.
Correct. That's right.
We do okay with that.
That's right. Correct. It has been much debated. People have eventually said that let us not call it hygiene hypothesis, let us call it immune training hypothesis. And a lot of immunity training.
So that's a scientific concept.
Correct. And as I told you that most of the immune training would happen in the gut. And therefore, maintaining a proper balance of different kinds of bacteria in the gut probably will train our body, immune train our body for new pathogens or something. That's the hypothesis.
That if CSIR is so well endowed, it has a lot of money, then why are these fellowship payments to PhD scholars and postdoc scholars delayed?
Yeah, that's a very pertinent question. I'm glad you asked the question. You know, I mean, the fellowship payment, the way we deal with it, it's ridden with some sort of bureaucratic process. right? Just like a payment that people like me receive from the government, we have to ensure that I have been in my office all days, or I have just not taken off and just roaming around on the streets doing nothing or something, right? So our salaries are very closely linked to the proof that I am working in the lab and I'm supposed to be doing the job that I've been assigned to. So fellowship payment to some extent also is really linked to the fact that the fellows have been in their place and working for the thing. So we depend upon universities and colleges and IITs and ISC to give us a statement that the fellow has been working on that. Maybe we can do away with that, just trust the fellows that have been working on this. We give 5 years fellowship. But a fellowship payment also is released to what is called as direct benefit transfer. And many times what has happened, I mean my own student has happened, that there was a mismatch between the number. The direct benefit transfer, you have to give your account number and IFSC code and all. And typically these codes are very long. And if there is even mismatch of 1 digit here and there, it doesn't actually go there. And then we are kind of foxed by this thing. So we depend upon colleges and universities to give us the correct codes. We depend upon them to give us the statement that the fellow has worked or not.
But you are trying to smoothen it.
We are trying very hard to smoothen it. And I fully sympathize with all the research scholars. I was a research scholar myself once. That if they don't receive fellowship, actually it pains me that they don't receive fellowship. We have also done a seropositivity CSIR for about 11,000 people. And our seropositivity tests are also very remarkable. We're quite revealing. We see about between 13 to 15% people who have been seropositive.
13 to 15.
Correct.
13 to 15.
Correct.
Yeah.
And we see a distinct difference between CSIR labs which are located in metros, where there is a higher seropositivity, versus CSIR labs which are in.
And when was this sero survey done? CSIRs?
So we are doing every 3 months.
Every 3 months.
So we started in July or August. We have already finished 2. The same population, we are doing it every 3 months.
Yeah. And what does TIFR survey show on Dharavi?
So TIFR survey coordinated by Gagandeep and Ullas and all. What they have shown is that about in excess of 50% people there we are seropositive. Yeah.
Are seropositive. So that is the highest number that we've got.
That's right.
It's a congested area.
That's right.
And we know what fatalities they've had, so that will marry into your hypothesis.
That's right. In fact, the whole world was watching with the breath, this thing.
Dharavi,
that
yes.
God forsaken, if there is an outbreak in Dharavi, many people had thought that there would be a catastrophe.
That's right.
But thanks to whatever powers be, that did not happen.
Yeah.
And we should really be relieved that the kind of catastrophe that was expected did not happen in Dharavi.